Continuing from our previous discussion on the relationship between sages and the political structures of their time, let's now turn our attention to a specific group often discussed in this context, the Sophists. We're going to explore what their professional lives actually looked like, moving beyond the stereotypes. So, when we talk about professional Sophists, what are we really getting at? For ages, scholars have used this term as the magic bullet to separate the Sophists from the old school philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. Think of it as drawing a line in the sand. But here's the thing, many modern scholars have started to say, hold on a minute. The Greek world wasn't quite that neat. There was a lot of overlap, a fluidity between different types of thinkers. So, the big question becomes, if they weren't fundamentally different, what is the difference? This chapter argues that maybe we shouldn't focus so much on whether they charged money or not. That's a bit of a retroactive label. Instead, let's look at what they did professionally, the intellectual activities they engaged in as practitioners of wisdom, and the surprising twist. When we do that, the Sophists don't seem quite so unique or exceptional. They appear to be much more plugged into the broader ecosystem of wisdom in 5th century Greece than we might have previously assumed. Now, trying to figure out the Sophists' professional lives is like trying to understand ancient fashion trends based only on descriptions by rival designers. Most of our information comes from sources that are, shall we say, critical. Take Socrates in his Antidosis. He paints a pretty vivid picture, doesn't he? Sophists making grand displays, arguing endlessly, basically turning public meetings into shouting matches. He describes them performing in public assemblies and private gatherings, making wild claims, bickering, insulting each other, and, ultimately, according to Isocrates, just making themselves look bad and giving the audience permission to laugh at them, praise them, or mostly, despise them. Okay, so we hear about these two settings, public and private, and this hyperbolic, seemingly counterproductive style. But can we just take this at face value? Does this mean their entire professional life was spent in these kinds of combative settings? Or was this just one side of the story, told by someone who clearly wasn't a fan? That's the tricky part we need to keep in mind. So why bother digging into all this? Why should we care about their professional lives? Well, it turns out how we interpret what they did professionally has a huge impact on how we see their intellectual contribution. Think about it. If you follow someone like Maru, who saw their whole gig as basically about making money, then your view of their contribution might be pretty narrow, just teachers, and that's about it. But if you, like Kerford, see their professional activities as also being about engaging in real intellectual debates and contributing to the ongoing conversation, then you might see them as establishing practices that shaped Western thought for centuries. It's a big difference. Similarly, understanding their professional lives helps us gauge their social standing. Was Guthrie right to see them as marginal figures, chasing cash and fame away from their hometowns? Or could their travel reflect something more sophisticated, navigating elite networks across different city-states, embedding themselves in aristocratic circles? See how interpreting their professional activities shapes our whole picture of them? Alright, let's talk about travel. One of the first things you notice about the Sophists is that they were constantly on the move. It's often presented almost casually. Oh, they traveled because they were clever and ambitious. Makes sense, right? But is that the whole story? The author suggests we need to add another layer. Yes, personality matters, but we also need to consider the cultural landscape. How did they actually get around? What gave them the authority to be welcomed in different city-states? Just having sharp wits wasn't enough. They needed to operate within certain social and institutional frameworks. So we need to look beyond just individual brilliance and consider the systems that enabled their extensive journeys. Now, think about travel in ancient Greece. It wasn't exactly like hopping on a plane. Thucydides gives us a glimpse of the difficulties. He talks about Brasidas needing an escort just to cross into Thessaly, especially since he was carrying arms. The general rule, he says, was that crossing another city-state's territory without permission was suspicious. Now this is about military movement, which is obviously different from a teacher traveling for lectures. But it highlights a crucial point. Travel wasn't automatic. It required arrangements, permissions, maybe escorts. It wasn't just wanderlust, it was a logistical challenge. Sadly, we don't have many detailed accounts of how Sophists managed their travel. But Thucydides reminds us that we shouldn't assume it was easy peasy. It needed explanation. Okay, so despite the challenges, they did travel extensively. Look at the evidence. Almost none of the famous Sophists hailed from Athens except Xenophon, and their main work happened elsewhere, though they all made pilgrimages to the Athenian agora. Plato's Apology gives us a striking image. Figures like Gorgias, Prodicus, and Hippias could apparently walk into any city and convince young men to ditch their local mentors and pay them instead. Similar things are said of Protagoras. We have specific examples. Protagoras writing laws for Thurii in Italy, visiting Sicily, dying on his way back. Hippocrates practically begged Socrates to introduce him to Protagoras, worried he might not see him again for years. Gorgias became a rock star at festivals across Greece, arriving in Athens at 60 and dazzling everyone. He taught everywhere, never staying put long. Prodicus wasn't just a teacher. He served diplomatic missions for his home city and combined these with his private lectures. Even Xenophon went to Boeotia to attend Prodicus' lectures while he was a prisoner. Hippias traveled all over Greece professionally, doing diplomacy for Illis, performing at Olympia, promoting his work in Sparta, and even seeking opportunities in Sicily. The picture is clear. These weren't sedentary academics. Of course, there were exceptions. Thrasymachus, born in Chalcedon but clearly a major player in Athens, delivering speeches to Athenians expected to be there for Plato's Republic discussion. Then there's Antiphon, the only Athenian in the usual lineup. He seems to have built his career closer to home, but still had connections beyond Athens, setting up shop in Corinth, and likely traveling as an ambassador during the oligarchic coup of 411 BCE. What does this tell us? Athens was definitely a hub, a major center for their professional lives. But it wasn't the only game in town. There was a whole ecosystem out there, including established figures in their own cities and itinerant experts passing through. Athens was important, but not the sole gravitational center. So, how did they navigate this complex world of travel? A key factor seems to be diplomacy and the Xenia network. Several sophists like Gorgias, Prodicus, Hippias, and Antiphon are explicitly linked to diplomatic missions for their home cities. Now, ancient diplomacy wasn't like modern statecraft. These envoys didn't have special titles or privileges, but they were usually citizens of high standing. And who facilitated these connections? The Xenia network, the system of guest friendships among the elite that tied different city-states together. This network was formalized through proxenos relationships. So, it makes perfect sense that the Sophists, being figures of social standing, would leverage this network. It wasn't just about personal charm. It was about being plugged into the established channels for intercity communication and access to local power structures. For Antiphon, this network would have been crucial for his aristocratic worldview and his political ambitions. And this access to elite networks wasn't just theoretical. Look at Plato's dialogues. Whenever a sophist rolls into Athens, guess where they stay? In aristocratic households. In the Protagoras, Callias is hosting Protagoras and the crowd listening in. Ostwald calls it a who's who of the Athenian upper class. In the Gorgias, Callicles, another aristocrat, hosts Gorgias. Why do this? Well, imagine you're a wealthy Athenian. Hosting a famous foreign intellectual like this isn't just hospitality. It's a way to rub shoulders with the best and brightest students and to boost your own image as a cultured, enlightened person. It's social networking with intellectual capital. And remember, this wasn't just about Athenians. The non-Athenian sophists were also leveraging these networks in their own cities, suggesting they weren't just outsiders flocking to Athens. They were prominent players in their own communities too. This dynamic reminds us of something else: poets. Poets also moved within these elite circles, often described as xenoi, guest friends, with their patrons. Think of Homer or Hesiod. Now, while they framed the relationship beautifully in terms of friendship and shared values, Hunter and Rutherford point out that underneath, financial transactions were absolutely fundamental. Patrons paid poets, sometimes poets even acted as diplomats. So, here we have a potential synergy. You have individuals recognized for their wisdom, who are adept at navigating social and political networks, and who are embedded in the Xenia system. It seems like a perfect recipe for becoming a go-to representative for your city-state in negotiations or mediations. Wisdom plus diplomacy plus social connections equals a powerful combination. But here's a crucial point. The Sophists weren't the first to associate travel with wisdom. This was deeply ingrained in Greek culture, stretching back to the Archaic period. Think of Pythagoras, whose philosophy, according to Isocrates, came directly from his travels and studies in Egypt. Or Solon, who, after shaking things up in Athens, famously embarked on a 10-year journey for the sake of theoria, literally, to see the world. Part of his trip took him to Egypt, and then to the court of Croesus in Lydia. Herodotus himself refers to Solon as a Sophistes, and Croesus explicitly links his reputation to both his wisdom and his travels. Democritus also famously tied his extensive inquiries to his extensive travels. Even in poetic form we see it. Empedocles describing his wandering lifestyle, followed by thousands seeking his advice, or Parmenides framing the path to enlightenment itself as a journey. The connection was already there. So the Sophists didn't invent the idea of the traveling sage. They inherited a cultural framework where wisdom and mobility went hand in hand. This means their travel wasn't just about personal ambition, it played a strategic role. Firstly, it tapped into this existing cultural association, adding to their mystique and lending legitimacy to their practices. Secondly, as we discussed, the Xenia network made this travel possible and practical. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly for their careers, travel allowed them to reach different intellectual venues and, crucially, to find and recruit students. Both Plato's Apology and Protagoras mention them traveling specifically to attract new disciples. So travel wasn't just a side effect, it was a core part of their professional strategy. Okay, let's zoom in on one of their primary activities, recruiting students. Plato seems to assume this was a major motivation for their travels. And he has a key source for this, the Hippias Major. Here Socrates recounts how Prodicus and Gorgias made a fortune by offering epidixis, these display pieces or lectures, and by associating with the young. So, we're talking about public performances and private tutoring sessions. We know surprisingly little about what these seminars actually looked like. How big were they? Did they happen alongside the big lectures? The fictionalized setting of the Protagoras dialogue might give us our best peek into these intimate teaching moments. In the Protagoras, we see this in action at Callias' house. Hippias is swarmed by students asking him about physics and astronomy. Prodicus is having conversations with students sitting right next to him. Protagoras himself is leading a whole entourage, a chorus of followers, through the portico. Notice the mix. There are Athenian youths there, presumably interacting briefly while the sophist is in town. But then there's a distinct group, mostly foreigners, who seem to have followed Protagoras around during his travels, his dedicated fan club, you might say. We even meet Antimorus of Mende, Protagoras' star student, whose engagement is described as professional, technical. Contrast that with Hippocrates, the eager Athenian aristocrat bursting into Socrates' house, who wants general education, like the kind he got from his regular tutors. He seems willing to pay a premium for this broader, sophistic approach. So, what did this look like in terms of commitment? It seems there were different levels. You had the quick hit, maybe a short immersion, while the sophist was in town. Then there was the longer-term thing, where students literally followed the sophist from city to city. And finally, the deep commitment, aiming to become a sophist yourself, like Antimorus. How long were these stays in Athens? The text doesn't specify, but the author leans towards weeks rather than months. Why? Look at Hippocrates' desperation. He barges in after just 2 days, unwilling to wait another day. If Protagoras was staying for 6 months, wouldn't that seem excessive? Plus, imagine trying to house Protagoras and his whole entourage at Callias' house for months. The emphasis in Plato is always on their constant movement. And remember the word used in Hippias Major for their earnings. The singular epidixis, pointing towards single lectures or short performances, not lengthy courses. We also see evidence of elite patronage playing a role. Wealthy Athenians like Callias were clearly investing heavily in educating their sons, paying fees to multiple sophists and even presocratics like Zeno of Elea. Socrates himself in the Meno suggests sending Meno to the sophist to learn practical skills for managing his household and city. And in the Theaetetus, he explicitly mentions sending young men to study with Prodicus. What did this education involve? The Q&A format seems prominent, echoing the Protagoras. We hear repeatedly that figures like Gorgias and Hippias would stick around after their lectures to answer questions. Aristotle notes that sophistic teaching involved assigning rhetorical speeches and Q&A discussions for students to memorize. Cicero confirms that Protagoras, Gorgias, and Antiphon produced written discussions on important topics. Were these circulated among students for memorization and coaching? It certainly supports that idea. And let's not forget logography, writing speeches for others, often attributed to Antiphon. So it seems like a mix of oral performance, Q&A, memorization of texts, and practical speech writing. Let's talk about those public displays, the epidixis. This term is often used to describe the sophists' lectures and presentations. However, we need to be careful. While the sources confirm they did give public performances, the word epidixis itself often carries a negative spin. It's not found in any surviving sophist writings. Plato uses it, often contrasting it with apodexis, rigorous proof. Thucydides uses it for politicians spouting nonsense for bribes. Isocrates uses it for ineffective oratory. So, when we talk about their epideixis, we're largely using Plato's terminology. It's likely not how the sophists themselves would have put it. They probably had a more positive term for what they were doing. Where did they perform these displays? Everywhere. Public and private venues were both used. Think of the Lyceum Gymnasium, where Prodicus and Protagoras gave readings. Think of the grand stages of the Panhellenic festivals like Delphi and Olympia, where Gorgias delivered his famous speeches. But they also held events in private homes like Callias or Callicles. Isocrates even distinguishes between lectures in public assemblies and private gatherings, which seems to fit the festival sites perfectly. In terms of format, it ranged from large performance-like settings at festivals to smaller, more intimate seminars in someone's house, allowing for that personalized interaction, Q&A, maybe even tutoring. These seminars could run for days, likely organized in private residences. What did they actually talk about in these lectures? A lot. Hippias at Olympia famously offered to speak on anything he'd prepared, listing an incredibly diverse range of topics: poetry, math, astronomy, music theory, even the art of memory. Gorgias, too, claimed to be able to talk about anything. If we try to categorize the surviving fragments, we might see three main themes: political speeches, like Gorgias' plea for concord; mythological parables, like Prodicus's choice of Heracles or Gorgias' defense of Helen; and philosophical treatises like Hippias' collection of sayings or Gorgias' radical on not being. But again, this is a modern classification. For the Sophists, all of this would likely fall under the umbrella of Sophia, wisdom. And we don't even know for sure if all these pieces were designed purely for oral delivery, or if some were meant to be read later. How did they present this material? Usually it seems it was a presentation followed by a Q&A session. Both Gorgias and Hippias are said to invite questions from the audience. But was that the only way? Perhaps not. There's evidence suggesting competitive debates involving multiple speakers. Consider the Hippocratic text on the nature of man. The author complains about these public debates on human nature, arguing that they achieve nothing, because the same speaker never wins 3 times in a row. Victory goes to whoever has the smoothest tongue before the crowd. Why? Because they lack real knowledge and stumble over themselves. Now this sounds like a critique of sophistry, doesn't it? And the timing, roughly 440 to 400 BCE, fits. The language used, antilegene, to debate, katabalene, to overthrow arguments, echoes titles of Protagoras' works. This suggests a link between these kinds of competitive intellectual contests and the sophist activities. Dio Chrysostom, writing centuries later around 350 BCE, gives another glimpse, albeit a less flattering one, of such events at the Isthmian Games. He describes crowds of wretched sophists shouting and reviling one another, their disciples fighting, writers reading aloud their stupid works, and fortune-tellers interpreting fortunes. Notice the tone? It's similar to Isocrates' description, competitive, abusive. Dio uses the verb epidiknoun, related to epidexis, to describe their public displays. And crucially, he uses the term thaumatos, wonder worker or juggler, a word Plato and Isocrates themselves used to disparage the sophists. So Dio's account reinforces the idea that public displays sometimes took the form of competitive debates, fitting nicely with the claim that Protagoras initiated contests in arguments. Their goals weren't just to entertain, they were actively trying to engage with the big questions of the day, to debate, to persuade, to make a name for themselves. Now we arrive at perhaps the most debated topic, teaching for pay. The standard claim, heavily promoted by Plato and echoed by many others, is that the Sophists were the first to offer instruction for money to anyone who wanted it. The controversy isn't really about whether they charged fees. That seems undeniable. It's about how we interpret this practice and how it's contrasted with other thinkers. Remember, people already paid for specific skills, music lessons, gymnastics training, learning to read and write. What supposedly made the Sophists unique was offering paid education aimed at general cultural improvement or excellence, not just a specific craft. Plato brings this up frequently, noting how figures like Protagoras, Gorgias, and Prodicus amassed large fortunes from their wisdom. Xenophon, Isocrates, and Aristotle all make similar points. But is this paid teaching narrative entirely accurate? Two big issues arise. First, selling wisdom, or appearing to treat intellectual exchange purely as a transaction, was never really culturally acceptable in the same way. Look at Isocrates. He had a financial relationship with his students, but he always frames it beautifully in terms of friendship, public service, and gratitude. Gifts given freely, not payments for services rendered. Aristotle's Lyceum seems to operate on a similar principle of voluntary gifts. Second, as we've seen, much of the discussion about their payment comes from sources that are, shall we say, critical. Xenophon calls them prostitutes. Plato defines them as hunters of wealthy young men. Even Aristophanes in his Clouds portrays Socrates' students teaching how to win arguments, regardless of whether they're right or wrong, for money. So, the question lingers, are we seeing historical fact, or are we seeing opponents trying to undermine them by highlighting their perceived mercenary nature? This leads us to skepticism. Maybe the Sophists weren't the absolute pioneers of general paid teaching, but simply operated differently from Plato and Aristotle, who chose not to charge fees. It seems reasonable to assume they needed income, like most professionals. But how much did they innovate in this area? We honestly don't know much about the funding models of educational institutions back then. Funding the Lyceum, for instance, remains obscure. And notice the language, it's often euphemistic, talking about gifts and reciprocity rather than contracts. Let's look at poets again. They were also called sophoi, moved in similar circles, and relied on patronage. Mostly they talked about friendship, but occasionally, like Pindar describing the muse as a prostitute, the transactional aspect peeked through. What stands out with the Sophists is how consistently their relationship with students is portrayed as purely transactional. Given the invective context and the sensitivity shown elsewhere about fees, we have to be cautious. Are we getting the full, unbiased picture, or is the emphasis on payment a way to delegitimize them? So, where does this leave us? Given the scarcity of direct evidence and the often biased nature of our sources, making definitive claims is always difficult. But what emerges is a picture of the Sophists as respected figures of wisdom, plugged into traditional forms of authority, often tapped for diplomatic roles, traveling widely within elite networks, teaching eager students, and contributing to the intellectual ferment of their time. The author argues convincingly that there's a significant overlap in their professional practices with other contemporary thinkers. The idea that they were a completely separate sui generis category starts to look shaky. Perhaps we should see them not as outsiders, but as a diverse group operating within the broader economy of wisdom in 5th century Greece. Ultimately, this challenges the way we often categorize ancient philosophy, dividing it into neat phases and distinct groups. While such categories can be useful analytical tools, applying them rigidly to the Sophists risks obscuring their deep roots in the wider tradition and their active participation in the vibrant intellectual life of their era. It pushes us to look beyond simple labels and appreciate the complexity of their professional world.